Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, and leadership practices, all by way of distilling lessons that we can then apply to our businesses and professional practices. So today, I'm going to be talking about the Berlin Airlift. So, and I keep forgetting to close my email. I don't want it dinging all the time in the background. So coming out of World War II, the Allies, of course, won, and Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones. So there was an American, British, French, and Soviet portion of Germany, and each country was tasked with administrating their piece. Now, the America, Britain, and France decided to administrate their 3 portions together, forming what became known as West Germany. And the Soviet Union administrated its portion by itself, becoming known as East Germany. Now, as well, the capital city of Germany, Berlin, was split into 4 zones. Again, American, British, French, and Soviet. And again, the three America, Britain, and France administrated their 3 portions of Berlin together, and the Soviet Union administrated their portion of Berlin by itself. The issue was Berlin was in the Soviet zone, and so there were transportation corridors essentially through the Soviet zone, so that at this point it was only 3 allies. After World War II, the Soviet Union quickly went its own way. So the American, British, and French had a corridor through the Soviet zone of Germany in order to get to their portion of Berlin. And as you might imagine, this was somewhat problematic just from the get-go. So in 1948, tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, the US, UK, and France, had really escalated. Because of the deep distrust that Stalin had all through the war for the intentions of the American and the British. It really escalated after the war, as well, and the Germany needed a lot of money to rebuild, and there were controversial plans, like even though the official program was denazification, former Nazi officials in many cases were kept on in official positions to make sure that the country could just run basic services, water, electricity, that sort of thing. So all of this was sort of swirling around. And in the meantime, the rise of black market activity in Germany after the war was pretty profound. And although the military authorities did their best to control it, because there were such significant shortages of everything from food, clothing, and even things, tobacco, which maybe we wouldn't consider a necessity today, but it was very much a part of life, back in the late 1940s. So There was a lot of problems with the black market. Violence came out of it. And as well, there were Germans who were just not on board with the occupation. And so there was sort of third column activity going on in both the Western Allies zone and the Soviet zone. There was also a great deal of spying going on between zones because the Western Allies wanted to know what the Soviets were up to. And of course, the Soviets wanted to know what the Western Allies were up to. And so Berlin especially became a good place, if you will, a fruitful place to be trying to gain intelligence on the other side. Now, the German economy took a long time to recover. One of the steps that the Western Allies took was to introduce a new currency in their zones called the Deutschmark. And this in particular angered the Soviets because they saw it as an attempt to sort of strengthen the western part of Germany at the expense of their zone, and again created a great deal of animosity between the Western Allies and Russia, really Soviet Union. So in response, um, on June 24th, 1948, the Soviets blockaded all the roads, rails, and canal routes into West Berlin, cutting off all food, fuel, and other essential supplies for over 2 million civilians living in the western zone of Berlin, i.e., West Berlin. The Soviets' goal was to get the Western Allies to abandon West Berlin, and that way the Soviets would have control of the entire city. They would no longer need to tolerate the Western Allies traveling through the eastern part of Germany to get to West Berlin, and it would be not only a major strategic victory, but it would also be a big step in controlling the Western Allies' ability to spy on the Soviet Union and the eastern part of Germany. So the Western Allies were really faced with a tremendous crisis. Now, of the three Western Allies, France itself was going through a significant rebuilding process. It had been, badly depleted during World War II, the Nazi occupation, even though not all of France was occupied by Nazi Germany, a lot of it was. There had been a lot of destruction, and so France was going through its own rebuilding period. And so it really fell to the United States and to a lesser extent on the UK, which, although never occupied in World War II, had really taken a large brunt of the fighting because of the Blitz, the bombing of England by Nazi Germany, the depletion of manpower from having fought really two world wars in only 20 years apart, basically. But nonetheless, the UK was better off certainly than France. Of course, the United States ended up after World War II as really the global superpower. And in theory, the Soviet Union was viewed as a superpower, but it didn't have anything like the economic might that the United States had post World War II. So, in response to the closure of the closure of West Berlin and the sort of attempted takeover of it, if you will, the U.S. and the U.K. launched the Berlin Airlift. It was known as Operation Vittles as in food, in the United States, and Operation Plainfare in the UK. And it began within days of the June 24th, 1948 closing of routes into West Berlin. So Allied cargo planes flew supplies into West Berlin essentially nonstop. They were, I believe, they were mostly C-54 cargo planes. This was a Douglas aircraft transport and cargo plane that had been developed and used in the latter part of World War II. It replaced the oh shoot, the more famous one that you see in all of the World War II movies. I'm going up on the designation, but the C-54 was a prop powered plane. Jet aviation was still pretty much in its nascency, and so these cargo planes brought in all kinds of supplies, food, fuel, all of the essential supplies necessary to support the 2 million civilians who were essentially trapped in West Berlin. At its peak, a plane landed in West Berlin every 45 seconds. Okay, if you can imagine how many planes that is, okay, in just an hour, that's let's see, 45 times 2, a minute and a half, times 20, no, times 40. So 40. So that's 80 planes. No, I'm sorry. That's 40 planes a minute, I believe. Okay, 40 planes. No, because it'd be 60 planes. 60 planes would be one every minute. Yeah, so it's 80 planes. 80 planes. I'm sorry, not a minute. Sorry, 80 planes an hour. 80 planes an hour landing, and they would be offloaded, and then the plane, after the cargo it was carrying was offloaded, it would take off to make another run. A tremendous logistical achievement. In total, there were over 277,000 flights, delivering 2.3 million tons of supplies, coal, food, medicine. Everything had to be brought in the airlift. And you can see that over the term of the airlift, roughly over a ton of supplies was brought in for each civilian trapped in West Germany. Okay, a ton being 2,000 pounds, so over a ton. In addition to the main Berlin airlift, there was something called Operation Little Vittles. And the pilots would drop candy to the children. I mean, the Air Force did it as a gesture of goodwill. I think the pilots did it because they felt bad for these children, and they wanted to give them a little treat. So just something to kind of brighten up their lives. If you can imagine, Berlin had been badly damaged during the war. A lot of people did not have really anything close to adequate housing. There was ruins and rubble throughout the city. Life was pretty bleak for children, especially, and so this was a way for the pilots to just make a gesture of caring about the children. So the blockade lasted for 11 months until May 12th, 1949, when the Soviets, realizing that the airlift had succeeded in foiling their attempt to cut off West Berlin and take it over, they lifted the blockade. So the Berlin Airlift stands as the first major confrontation of the Cold War. And it was an incredibly powerful symbol of the resolve, the ingenuity, and the commitment of the Western Allies to protecting their zones in Germany overall, but in particular West Berlin, and pushing back on Soviet aggression that was seeking to gain hegemony within its zone over Berlin. So there was a wonderful movie made about the Berlin Airlift just a year after it ended in 1950. It's called The Big Lift. It stars one of the great actors of that time, Montgomery Clift, who plays one of the pilots. I believe there's a love story in it. He falls in love, I think, with a German woman, if memory serves. I've seen the movie a couple of times. It's a black and white movie, which really gives you kind of a feel of the grittiness of the damage that Berlin had sustained, during World War II. And there is a fairly high level of historicity to the movie. So if you want to know more or get a better sense about what was going on and how the Berlin Airlift relieved the 2 million people living in West Berlin, I recommend the movie to you. Of course, there's books and all kinds of information about the Berlin Airlift that you can study. But if you're looking for to just get a sense of it, the movie is not quite 2 hours long, and I recommend it to you. It's a solid portrayal of historical fiction that will give you a sense of just how dramatic the Berlin Airlift was, and what a victory it was for the Western Allies over the Soviet Union. So I distilled from the Berlin Airlift 7 business lessons, and I think you're going to find these are a little bit different. Not a little bit. They're different than the lessons that I typically talk about on this show, and I think for good reason. The Berlin Airlift, while it was a military operation, it was neither an offensive or defensive combat situation. It was a humanitarian relief situation. Today, we think of humanitarian relief as being just part of military operations. I know when I was in the Navy, my ship, I was on the USS Ronald Reagan. I was the Air Wing chaplain, as you know, if you've seen the show before. We were tasked with humanitarian relief in 2011 when Japan experienced the earthquake and tsunami and the Nakajima nuclear reactor meltdown. So, and we didn't think anything of being sent to do humanitarian assistance. It is a firm part of military operations these days. But in the late 1940s, humanitarian assistance was not a big part of the military playbook. And so the Berlin Airlift also stands as an example of what the military can accomplish in a non-combat way. And so I think you'll find that the lessons we can learn from a business perspective are different than those that might come out of a combat situation. For example, I think it was last week I talked about lessons that could be learned from the invasion of Grenada, and those sorts of situations. So lesson number 1 is constraints drive innovation. So with roads, rails, canals shut down, the only way to get into to get supplies to West Berlin was through air delivery. Now, it's not that supplies had never been delivered by air before. Of course, they had throughout the war. However, air supply during World War II was really relegated to crucial cargoes or the bringing in of personnel, paratroopers, that sort of thing. The idea of supplying a major operation purely through the air, that really didn't happen in World War II. And in fact, it's still, even today, it's not a particularly practical way to supply anything. Air supply is very limited in capacity. It's expensive, and so like I said, it's even today, it's not a primary means used for supply. So even on an aircraft carrier where we have a COD, a carrier onboard delivery. Uh, it's a detachment, not a squadron. They will bring supplies onto the ship, and they'll bring people onto the ship. That is not the way the ship is supplied overall. We have what are called UNREPs, underway replenishments, and a cargo ship basically uh, meets us and wherever the meeting point is, generally somewhere in the ocean. Generally speaking, we're not docked when at least an aircraft carrier is resupplied, and the ships sail in parallel, and they transfer goods using kind of a line and pulley system almost. So the idea of using aircraft to do a major and continual resupplying process was innovative in the late 1940s. So, but it turned out to be very effective. Now, you could say, well, why did the Soviets allow all these cargo planes to fly over their airspace? And the bottom line was, the Soviets weren't willing to get into a hot war with the Western Allies, which, if they had shot down any of those cargo planes, would have been the case. That's number one. And number two, I think that the Soviet leadership really thought this can't go on. It can't go on and on and on. They can't sustain this for the long term. And in the event, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the airlift lasted for almost a year. Okay. So the business lesson to this is when traditional channels close, so new business processes, new distribution models need to be created, number one. And number two, a lack of constraints doesn't necessarily lead to creativity and innovation. Oftentimes, innovation is the result of constraints and needing to find a creative way to deal with them, okay, that otherwise wouldn't be thought of because the constraints aren't there, and so the company doesn't have to worry about it. They can just continue doing what they've been doing all along, or maybe just make some changes at the margins. So it is during crises and crises that cause constraints to the running of our businesses. Oftentimes, those are when we find the most creative solutions, the most and innovation is really driven because the businesses or the professional practice is facing an almost existential situation. Okay, let's take a break. Probate and trust. America is a maritime nation. Our freedom and security depend on strong sea services. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League stands with our Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marine through community support, education, and advocacy. For over 120 years, Americans of all walks of life have heeded our call. No prior military service is required to join our mission. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League of the United States. Help us support those who serve at sea. Visit NavyLeague.org. Okay, a little misstart on the sponsor spot, but this is Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel. I'm talking about the Berlin Airlift, which took place from June 1948 to May 1949. And it was an effort on the part of the Western Allies, the United States, the UK, and France, to supply 2 million civilians living in West Berlin who, by the action of the Soviet Union, had been cut off from road-based and rail-based and canal-based resupply. So because this was a humanitarian aid situation as opposed to a combat situation, the lessons are different from ones that I typically discuss on the show. The first one I mentioned is that constraints drive innovation. So that's number one. Number two, logistics are, or at least can be, strategy. So the success of the Berlin Airlift rested with being able to organize air corridors and scheduling flights down to the minute, and then streamlining unloading operations. Now, the Western Allies, it was really the US and the UK, did not have an unlimited number of aircraft. Indeed, there were just so many aircraft that could be devoted to the Berlin Airlift. As well, they didn't have an unlimited number of pilots, and pilots could fly, but they had to eat, they had to rest, right? Otherwise, it would be dangerous for them to fly. And so the Berlin Airlift really was a creature of strategy in logistics. And as I mentioned, toward the beginning of the show, at its height, there was a plane landing every 45 seconds. I mean, when you think about that, that is an amazing logistical achievement. I mean, in commercial airports today, I don't think they reach anything like landings happening that close together, right? They leave a much larger margin for error. Probably, I don't know exactly what it is, but I suspect it's at least a couple of minutes, right? So it showed you the ability to create this logistical system, and the pilot's ability to operate within it was really extraordinary, right? And so when we look at strategizing for our businesses, okay, operations and supply chain management can be, probably are, as critical as product development and marketing. So I think too often businesses, especially businesses that are being developed on some, great idea, so they're so focused on, building this, this great new car, this great new product, and then marketing it, they forget that the sustainability of the business really rests on supply and operations. It's great to have, a million orders for a million of your products, but if you can't meet those orders, your business is going to collapse. And in fact, many businesses do collapse because their supply and operations can't keep up. And in fact, I know someone who used to be a supplier. It was a food product, and he did very well supplying to supermarkets. And then one day along comes Walmart, at the time the biggest retailer in the world. Now, one would think it would be amazing to be able to have Walmart as one of your customers, but the problem is that the demands that Walmart made on his business were so huge that his supply and operations couldn't keep up with it. And in the end, they essentially destroyed his business. So logistics are strategy. They're part of your overall business strategy, and they need to be treated that way. The people who are making decisions about the direction of the company, you need to include people who deeply know operations and supply to make sure that whatever the business is planning, it can keep up. I know for myself as a professional, right? in the end, all I really have to sell is my time. Okay. And I can't work 24 hours a day. In fact, I can't even work, 16 hours a day. On occasion, I have to, but the reality is, to be sustainable, there's only so many hours a day I can work. So the more productive I can be during those hours, the more successful my business will be. That productivity comes from understanding the operational side of my business, right? This is why AI is such a boon for my business, because it allows me to get a lot more done in the same amount of time, right? So logistics are strategy. That's lesson number 2. Lesson number 3 is commitment builds trust. As you might imagine, after World War II ended and Nazi Germany was forced to surrender and surrender unconditionally, that was what the Allies vowed to require of Nazi Germany. There were a lot of Germans who were, shall we say, uh, unhappy that they lost the war, number one. Number two, very suspicious of the Allies, who shortly after the war ended were coming in as liberators, even though just not long before that they had been bombing cities. They had been at war with the military, Germany's military, and undoubtedly many, probably most Germans had either had a relative killed, wounded, or captured by the Allies. Um, at the minimum, they knew someone who had someone killed by the Allies, and now all of a sudden they're here telling us they're going to take care of us and rebuild us. Not a lot of trust there. Okay, and that was why you don't hear about it very much, but there was definitely guerrilla activity going on in Germany, in the western part of Germany, administrated by the Western Allies. Uh, there was underground activity against the occupation. There were attempts at assassinations of American officials, American military people. Like I said, a lot of turmoil and a lack of trust among a lot of the Germans being occupied. So by and again, not just in West Berlin, in Western Germany as well. So one of the things that the Berlin Airlift did was it showed that the Western Allies were absolutely committed to maintaining the civilians in West Berlin, supporting them and seeing to it that they were not abandoned to the Soviets. For whatever the mistrust was between Germans and the Western Allies, their mistrust of the Soviet Union was much higher. And in fact, there were German units who desperately tried to surrender to the Western Allies militaries rather than having to surrender to the Soviet military, because the Soviet military was infamous for essentially just slaughtering captured Germans, as well as just depraved activity against German civilians. So German civilians too attempted to get out of what became the Soviet occupation zone because they were afraid of the depredations that the Soviet Union would wreak on the Germans after the war was over. And without getting into the details, you can conjure up in your mind what those were. So to see that the Western Allies were absolutely committed to maintaining their control of West Berlin created much more trust, not only on the part of West Berliners, but West Germans as well, because they saw that the U.S. and the U.K. did not abandon West Berlin. They went through this incredibly difficult airborne logistical plan to make sure that that West Berliners survived. And again, this is an object lesson for us in business. We really need to gain the trust of our customers and clients. Having gained that trust, we need to constantly be working to reinforce it. And sometimes that means we're going to have to take risks to demonstrate to our customers and clients that we merit their trust. So, again, I'll use my own business as an example. One of the things I do to gain and maintain the trust of my clients is to be open when I make mistakes. Right? I go into an administration of an estate or trust by telling them I'm going to do my best to make, to be as error-free as possible. But let's just understand from the get-go, I'm going to make mistakes. When I do, I'm going to let you know that I've made a mistake, and I'm going to bring to you what I'm going to do to correct that mistake. Okay, so I feel that openness and honesty it gives them the basis to trust me. So rather than trying to hide from my clients or potential clients, that I, made a mistake or might make a mistake, I tell them that up front, set realistic expectations, but also expectations that they can live with and that demonstrate that I'm trustworthy. Okay. All right. Number 4, scale through systems. So as you can imagine, with over 277,000 flights into West Berlin, this was not a program, if you will, of individual glory. This was a program about thousands of people creating a system that could be executed with precision on a highly collaborative basis. Okay, so there were ego was not an issue, and in fact, George Marshall, who was Secretary of State, I believe, at this time, and had launched the larger, what became known as the Marshall Plan for rebuilding Germany and Europe, right? He was very modest about his part in all of the rebuilding of Europe and Germany in particular. What he fostered an attitude of, we're doing this together, and this is not about individual glory. This is about all of us working together in order to bring about the kind of improvement in living conditions that people in Europe need in order that they can trust us and become our strong allies in the future. So from a business standpoint, okay, it behooves us to focus on building repeatable, coordinated systems, not just relying on star performers. So if we've got 5 salespeople in our organization, but one of them generates, 80 or 90% of sales, that's a problem. Because if that person chooses to leave, our business could very well collapse. On the other hand, where also that person has a tremendous amount of leverage over the company, and if that person makes demands on threat of leaving, what choice will the company have but to at least negotiate, if not accede outright, to those demands. So rather than the company being able to be held hostage by one or maybe two star performers, it's better for the company to create coordinated systems that encourage people to, and all people within the company, to be successful in their respective roles. And in so doing, build a strong foundation of a systematic building of ever greater success for the company, right? So scale comes through building systems, and I would say that sustainable growth for a company comes from building systems far more so than recruiting or maintaining star performers. Okay, that's number 4. Number 5, small gestures can have an outsized impact. So I mentioned Operation Little Vittles, where pilots would drop candy to the children just to give them a little treat and to let them know that they're being remembered, that sort of thing. So one pilot in particular, Lieutenant Gale Halverson, he was known as the Candy Bomber because he was flying this C-54 and dropping candy to the children. So it really humanized the operation. It boosted the morale, and it showed goodwill between the Western Allies and the West Berliners. And this kind of small symbolic act really changed the tone of what was going on between the Western Allies, pilots and other personnel who were running the Berlin Airlift, and the people living there. The parents, too, of course, appreciated that their children were getting these little treats. They couldn't supply them to their children, they weren't available. And so the fact that their children could have, some candy or chewing gum or whatever it was that they got, parents saw that these pilots cared about them and their children as individuals. They weren't just this sort of amorphous mass that was being taken care of. So small gestures can have an outsized impact, and we can do the same thing with our clients and customers. So my friend Bill, who is a podcaster, like a more successful podcaster than me. So after someone is a guest on his show, about a week or so later, what shows up but a package with a couple of coffee mugs in it, with the guest's picture on the mugs, and the thumbnail for the show on which that guest appeared. And it's just a little gesture, but the mugs are very nice, and it's a nice way of saying thank you to a guest, and completely unnecessary, because I've been a guest on Bill's show, I think a couple of times now. Look, I do it in order to help educate people. I do it to promote myself and my business. I do it to help out a friend. All of those are great reasons, and I don't need a thank you. But the fact that Bill does that, this little gesture, I think is very nice, and it shows a level of thoughtfulness that is different than most podcasters, right? So small gestures can have an outsized impact. We can build those into our practices. So I know when I communicate with my clients, and I do a weekly report to the people with whom I'm working when I administrate an estate, I always make it a point to, if they have children, ask about their children, how are they doing, or I make it a point to wish them a restorative weekend, just a small thing like that, so that they know that they're not just a client to me, they are people, and I recognize that they have lives beyond what we're dealing, and that undergirding everything is that we're human beings, and we should treat each other with decency and caring and kindness, especially because of, I'm dealing with people when somebody has passed away. There's a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety going on. So look for small gestures that you can exhibit toward your customers and clients that will bind them more closely to you, and have that kind of outsized impact. Okay, next, collaboration beats competition in a crisis. So, this is not a knock on competition. Competition is important. It can motivate people and organizations to give their best, trying to outcompete the other competitors. However, in a crisis, oftentimes collaboration is much more important. And in the case of the Berlin Airlift, the US, the UK, and France coordinated efforts and pooled resources instead of competing for credit, instead of focusing on, what was formerly their part of the Western zone and saying, look, I can only take care of my own, right? All three countries worked together in the face of this Soviet aggression. And this was important because the level of coordination that it took to get to the point where so many aircraft could be landed and unloaded so quickly, much better done by coordinating than it would have been by competing. Imagine, three different groups or even two different groups of aircraft trying to fly into West Berlin on a competitive basis. Not a recipe for success. So, and indeed, while there was competition in the war effort to defeat Nazi Germany, especially between General George Patton's Third Army and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's First Army. Uh, uh, in the end, the Allied effort was a highly coordinated effort, not always smoothly coordinated, but coordinated nonetheless. And that, in the end, is what won World War II, right? And so that was taken to even greater heights during the Berlin Airlift. So oftentimes in business, while again, competition can be a powerful force for getting us to get the best out of our team members, out of our people, and create the incentive to beat the competition. Other times, strategic partnerships and alliances can be more effective in overcoming challenges that a single company couldn't do on their own. I know oftentimes, and I have another part of my professional work where I work with companies, in particular startups and early stage companies and companies in transition. So oftentimes I'll talk to, not oftentimes, but sometimes I'll talk to the owner of a company who's intent on building kind of a big multifaceted organization, and I ask him, like, why do you want to be doing all these other things? Your expertise is in this one area. Why don't you create strategic alliances with other companies that do these other things and knows how to do them well, rather than trying to create this behemoth organization, right? So we can grow our businesses more effectively oftentimes through strategic alliances and partnerships than we can by trying to grow organically and do everything ourselves. Okay, and especially when we need to respond to a crisis, right? So we can, I know in my fiduciary practice, people ask me, well, how does it work? And I say, well, typically I'm the team captain, and then I bring in the other professionals that are necessary to administrate that particular estate. And that's important because I can create smaller or larger teams based on the necessity of the situation, and I don't have to worry about maintaining a massive overhead by having everything in-house. So I can work more efficiently, I can work more cost effectively by creating strategic alliances rather than having everything in-house. Okay? So collaboration beats competition, especially in a crisis. And then finally, resilience wins over force. So I think that the central lesson of the Berlin Airlift was, as I've mentioned several times, the Soviets were aggressive in trying to essentially force the Western Allies out of Berlin. But because of the Allies' persistence in the Berlin Airlift, 277,000 plus flights over 11 months, they demonstrated, the Western Allies demonstrated they would be resilient in the face of this crisis, and they weren't going to be forced out. And so resilience really did triumph over force in Berlin in 1948, 1949. So the Western Allies did not fold. In fact, they wore down the Soviets until the Soviets folded, right? And this is, I think, the perhaps crucial lesson for businesses from the Berlin Airlift. As a business, we should be in it for the long haul. Okay, we should be looking to build enduring organizations that can survive and consistently provide the highest quality products and services to our clients and customers. And that means we need to be able to build resiliency so we can outlast a challenge. Sometimes getting through a challenge is just that. It's digging down inside of ourselves and having our team members do the same thing so we can outlast the situation until the other people finally give up. I had a situation like that last year with one of the assets in one of the estates I'm administrating. It was a property management company. It still is a property management company. It exists to this day. The reason it exists is because despite several of the company's clients essentially trying to force us to close down because they didn't like what was happening, okay, we outlasted them. Okay. And so today the company is stabilized and it's poised for growth. I think much to the chagrin of some of the former clients. Now, it did require us to essentially fire those clients. Sometimes that's what's necessary. Sometimes for an organization to be resilient in the face of force and to endure, we have to be willing to push away those people who are trying to force us to do something that's not in the long-term interest of the company. Okay, but if we train our people, if we create an ethos of resilience among our team members and our employees, the people who make up our organization, then we have the best shot at enduring not only through a crisis, but through the kind of brute force that we sometimes encounter in a business situation. So, those are the 7 lessons that I think we can take from the story of the Berlin Airlift, an amazing time in world history, one that I think still redounds today in the relationship between Germany and the United States, Germany and the UK. We saw eventually the creation of NATO, an alliance that still exists to this day. And this should give us an example for business that if we can get through crisis, it can set the stage for building truly endurable alliances and relationships with our clients and customers. So I thank you very much for joining me today, especially my live viewers. Always a treat to know you're there. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. And then next week on Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time, I'll be back with the next episode of Trusts and Estates Weekly. Yesterday, of course, there was a special edition of the Way to Wow shows for Labor Day. And then a week from today, I'll be back with the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military. So if you like this show and you know someone who you think would enjoy it, I would really appreciate it if you would tell them about it, maybe send them a link to the show on YouTube. I'd love to have the opportunity to earn their viewership and perhaps their subscribership as well. So wishing you a wonderful rest of the day and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times, my friend.